My dear friends, today St. Paul is, through his direct appeal to the people of Corinth to help with some collections, to help the poor and needy in Jerusalem, is reaching out to us also today. And we hear, especially in our second reading, St. Paul making this appeal directly to the Christians in Corinth. Picking up collection, especially for the poor and needy in Jerusalem, that was undergoing great famine and difficulties, was at the heart of St. Paul. And even in his letter to the Galatians, he recorded that when he and Barnabas had gone to introduce themselves to the rest of the apostles, and after they had been given the right hand of fellowship and sent out to the Gentiles, he was glad that they would have them remember the poor, which very thing he was very eager to do. We think of St. Paul usually as a very spiritual giant. But at the heart of St. Paul, and what anchored his great spiritual gifts, was his deep recognition of the physical and human needs of those who were struggling and suffering. This appeal to the Corinthians was not the first. When we read the rest of the chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians, we realize that St. Paul already had made an appeal for collection to support the poor in the churches of Thessalonica, that's the Christians of Thessalonica, and also of Philippi, the Philippians. Why St. Paul was very direct with the Christians in Corinth was, the city of Corinth was a very wealthy and prosperous harbor city. They were not only materially wealthy, but as we read from the first letter of Corinthians, the church of Corinth was spiritually wealthy. And that is why many of our knowledge of the spiritual gifts and charisms that operate even today amongst us, we get it from the first letter of Corinthians. And that is a manifestation among the very Christians of Corinth. So yes, Corinthian was a very rich city. Endowed, yes, it was a harbor city. It was prosperous materially and wealth, but also it was spiritually wealthy. Now, what St. Paul did was to invite the Christians in Corinth to expand and to anchor these spiritual gifts in what he calls gracious acts. So we read as we heard in our first reading, brothers and sisters, as you excel in every respect, in faith, utterance, knowledge, all earnestness, and in your love for us, may you excel in this gracious work also. Having been associated with this parish, the Church of St. Paul, since the summer of 2017, when I was a deacon, mentored under Father Jim and our very own good deacon, Deacon Tim Zenda, I can give testimony to a certain extent to the life here in the Church of St. Paul. It is a life that bears testimony to some of the things that St. Paul mentions in our readings today. The Church of St. Paul is a community that excels in every respect, in faith, in knowledge, and that sees almost every time the great wonders and miracles of God in our lives. And not too long ago, just this past Wednesday, those of us who had the opportunity to be here witnessed that again. How God extends his hands in very extraordinary but simple ways to touch our lives and to fill us with his grace and love. Now, I believe that God's exhortation for us today as St. Paul made to the Christians in Corinth is that we may now also excel in our gracious acts. This gracious act is the appeal to contribute to the material needs of others in need, our brothers who are struggling. For St. Paul, I believe this act was not only a responsibility, it was not only a social responsibility, but it was an opportunity for the Christians in Corinth to invest and be part of the spiritual endowment of the Christians in Jerusalem, the mother church, the place where our Lord Jesus came to start the foundation of his kingdom here on earth. The Christians in Jerusalem are not just other Christians, but for St. Paul, the Christians in Jerusalem were the remnants of the new covenant. St. Paul gives us two reasons, two motives, and I want to suggest these motives as the guidelines for Christian charity, the guidelines for Christian generosity. The first, St. Paul says that he calls on the Corinthians to be generous, not just out of their abundance, but in imitation of Jesus, who though was rich, made himself poor, that we too will be rich. It is a life to live in imitation of the generous acts of God himself, as you and I experience daily in this church. I recently learned, just about a few days ago, that even today in our day and age, we still have Christian brothers and sisters who strive day in, day out to imitate Jesus strictly and directly in this way, to make themselves poor that others may be rich. Recently, I learned of a Christian and a Catholic brother, a fellow Christian called Alan Graham, associated with the Mobile Loaves and Fishes out in Texas. From what I learned from our conversation and later on reading up on him, I learned that Alan Graham was a successful multi-million real estate investor and developer. And out of the blue, moved by the Spirit, he abandoned all these and began to serve the poor, the needy, and especially the homeless. Here in the Twin Cities, we have our very own Mary Jo Copeland, whom many of us consider a living saint. These Christian brother and sister give us the encouragement that it's possible to imitate Jesus in this way. It's possible that we too can make ourselves poor in one way or another, that others may become rich. Donating $1 make you $1 poorer. But donating that $1 makes one person $1 richer. That is just how simple it can be sometimes. We too may not be called to abandon everything and share them out, but that there are ways that we can reach out. The second principle of Christian generosity that St. Paul outlines is that in being generous, the Christians in Corinth seek equality among their fellow brothers and sisters. This equality is an equality in dignity as the sons and daughters of God. It is an equality in the measure that Jesus made himself equal to us. And this equality extends beyond smiling and extending a hand of greeting to one another here in church. It extends to being able to look into the eye of another person on the street. It extends to being able to say a word of greeting to someone seated by the gate entering into Walmart or Target. It is being able to bring out your hand and extend the hand of greeting to someone standing by the road with a sign. I need food. That we are able to look each other in the eye without looking away, feeling ashamed, or even feeling threatened, is that equality that St. Paul envisions that by sharing and being generous, we can achieve in our life today and always. It is an equality, St. Paul says, where those who have gathered much will have nothing over, no surplus, because they are generous. And he who gathered little will have no lack. There's a true story in my diocese about a priest. On one Sunday, just like this, he prepared and went out to one of the mission parishes in the diocese. And this mission parish was deep, was in the deep part of the main parish. By car, it takes an hour. By motorbike, maybe 45 minutes. For some reason, this priest was very excited about sharing the gospel of that Sunday. He came out with a well-thought, well-written out 2-page homily that he was even convinced about it himself. When this priest arrived at this mission parish, 15 earlier, he met only the catechist. And usually in my diocese, it's usually normal for the priest to wait for the congregants to come. And sometimes they would only go to bath when they see the priest riding their motor in. After a few minutes, the priest enters, he sets up the mass, prepares everything, he reads over his homily again, still very excited to preach this word that he had received from God to the people. When mass started, there were a handful of elderly women who came. Towards the Gloria, another handful of elderly women came. And by the time he was going to preach, give the homily, with the priest included, there were only 3 men in the church for that Sunday. And many of these women, elderly women who were present, were either blind, were crippled, or were just weighed down by old age. So, Father looks at his homily, he looks at the congregation, he folds his homily and puts it back in his pocket, mumbles to himself or maybe to God and says, these people don't need a 2-page homily. They need food and health care. Father finished the mass. He didn't preach. He couldn't preach that Sunday. Then after mass, he returned to the parish center, organized something, and came back with some cereals, some maize and some rice and some oil and whatever he could get to distribute to these poor, lonely, elderly women. It was in the middle of the year, and yet it was Christmas for that community. The name of this parish is the Church of St. Paul. It's the Church of St. Paul. And this is the parish I was assigned to after my ordination. And even after 20 years, anytime I went there for Mass, they would always ask, even though many have since passed on, but the story kept going. And they will ask, how is Father? We haven't seen him. It's been a long time. Because they remembered that what Father did was what they hear in the scriptures. It's what they hear of Jesus himself. The final instruction of Jesus to the parents of the 12-year-old who has just been raised from the dead is very instructive for us. Yes, Jesus has given us faith. Yes, Jesus has filled us with a zeal for his ministry and work. Yes, Jesus has caused his wonders to be exhibited amongst us for his glory. We have experienced miracles that Jesus performs amongst us and through us for one another. But Jesus leaves something for us to do. He leaves something that is within our own power to do. So Jesus tells the parents of the little girl, I've done my part. It's your turn now. Give her something to eat. You and I have that power also, to give something to someone to eat, to give a cloth to someone to wear, to give sandals to someone to walk on. We too have the power to make someone feel loved. Generosity is what anchors our spiritual gifts. Someone may come and experience the great wonders of God, but what will make that person stay is that personal sacrifice on our part, going the extra mile, sacrificing that which properly belongs to us, that they too can have a share. That is what makes communities grow. That is what makes the faith anchored. But above all, it is how we too get to invest in the spiritual endowment of the poor that is set for us in heaven. Any act of generosity for the well-being of another person always expands and opens our hearts to receive God's blessings. May the name of the Lord be praised now and forever.